Okay, had several requests for this song here by all the Hoagie Carmichael fans called Georgia's on My Mind. Georgia, Georgia, the whole day through. Wait, oh no, not that song. I don't know that song. Oh, George is on my mind. Goes like this. George Bush, George Burns, George Jones, George Benson, George C. Scott, George Reeves, George Wallace, George Hallis, George Washington, George Washington Carver, George Jefferson, George Jetson, George Papard, George Harrison. Boy George, by George, George of the Jungle, George Strait, Chris George, Lyndon A. George, George Patton Phyllis, George Custer, George McQuillan, George Foster, George Martin, George Thorogood, George Carlin, George Hamilton, George Roth, George Jessel, Tallulah Gorge, Susan George, Curious George, Georgie Porgy, George Clinton, George Siegel, George McGovern, Jeff, George Lindsay, George Sanford Brown, George Lucas, George McRae, George Schultz, George Mikan, Gorgeous George Jr., everybody! George Orwell, George Wendt, George Clooney, George Goebel, George Michael, George Foreman. All right, folks, how many children did George Foreman have? I don't even know if anybody knows anymore, but there was one point where he had 10, 5 boys and 5 girls. What did he name all 5 of his sons? Georgetown, George Nesmith, George Will, George Montgomery, George Steinbrenner, Georgie Fame, George from Mice and Men, George Allen, George Rogers, George the Gipper, George Gershwin, George Gervin, Machine Gun Kelly. His name was George Zaharias, George Kennedy, George Brett, George Mitchell, George Stephanopoulos, Chief Dan George London, George Clinton, George McGinnis, George Rogers Clark, George Bernard Shaw, George Seaford Eddy, George the Animal Steel. Who remembers George the Animal Steel? You gotta be kind of old. He was in love with Elizabeth, and he had to eat the turnbuckle, to be calmed down. What about the guy who saved baseball? They called him Babe Ruth, but his name was really George Herman. He thought the world would be a better place without him. Made a movie with Jimmy Stewart. Had Zuzu's pedals in his pocket. George Bailey. He was in Star Trek and he came out of the closet, at light speed. George Takei makes the red Irish beer. George Killian. For all you Seinfeld fans, George Costanza. And George is on my mind. That's hard without an audience. I hope that you yelled George at the right time. See ya.